Content warning. This narrative contains discussion of sexual violence, slavery, execution, and the treatment of minors in medieval contexts. Descriptions are clinical and intended for historical analysis. Readers who may be distressed should take care. If you value documented history presented with care, subscribe and stay through this investigation, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. For almost a millennium, the image of the Viking has been shaped by longships cutting a gray sea, by sagas of warriors and kings, and by museum cases that display ornate brooches and sword hilts. What too often remains at the margins of those displays and of popular memory are the lives and fates of women taken when those ships put to shore, of the wives and daughters who were captured, traded, enslaved, or killed. This is not a tale of mythical cruelty, but a reconstruction grounded in chronicles, law codes, archaeological stratigraphy, isotopic signatures, and the ledger-like traces that survive in stone and soil. The question posed by the title is stark. What happened to Vikings' defeated wives? The evidence, read across disciplines, reveals patterns of seizures, commerce, legal sanction, and at times organized eradication that demand attention and moral accounting. The story begins where raiding and sanctuaries intersect, monasteries and coastal settlements. Monastic chronicles, often written by survivors or by clerics whose interests were in relics and revenues, record attacks with a terse arithmetic. Churches burned, treasures seized, captives taken. Those entries are partial and biased, emphasizing plunder over people. Archaeology supplies a corrective. Burnt layers above occupation horizons, charred timbers dated by dendrochronology to the exact year's chronicler's name, abandoned chalices recovered alongside beads and belt fittings. In the soil between pews and choir, archaeologists find something the annals rarely enumerate: the discarded traces of human bodies, hurried burials, or no burials at all. Burnt soil and an absence of expected graves can point to a fate not recorded in praise-saturated records. Dublin, known in many sources by its Old Norse name, was both a target and a hub. Excavations at Wood Quay and other loci in the Viking Age settlement expose layers of habitation, docks, and workshops. They also reveal spaces that functioned as marketplaces where human beings were exchanged. Finds of pen-like enclosures, chains and shackles, animal pens repurposed for human containment, and faunal remains that indicate large-scale provisioning together sketch an infrastructure for holding and trading captives. Merchant manifests, rarely preserved in full text but sometimes fragmentally referred to in contemporaneous notes or in runic inscriptions, suggest the commodification of people. Where such material is lacking, isotopic analysis steps in. Oxygen and strontium isotope ratios in teeth, when compared to local baselines, can indicate non-local origins, while mtDNA lineages show maternal ancestry from regions across the Baltic and Scandinavian mainland. The accumulation of non-local female isotopic signatures in urban burial assemblages is not simply the trace of migration. In the context of contemporaneous accounts, pens and shackles, and legal codes that permit or regulate slavery, it becomes evidence of forced movement. York, Jorvik, offers another lens. Excavations there have unearthed layers of domestic life overturned, pits with mixed refuse and human bone, and structures interpreted as temporary holding cells. Skeletal remains from certain deposits show trauma consistent with violence, and burial patterns that depart from local Christian rites. The local economy of Jorvik, a mercantile knot at the heart of riverine trade, turned on mobility, and mobility required both sailors and the systems to supply them. Captives were part of that supply chain. The archaeological record alone cannot always tell us whether a particular woman found in an urban context was a captured spouse from a defeated household or a voluntary migrant married into a new community. But when skeletal chemistry, contemporary economic signals, and the occasional textual reference are read side by side, the likelihood of forced capture increases in some assemblages. Legal frameworks both constrained and enabled these practices. Old Norse sources, Icelandic Grágás law tracts, continental compilations, and later Norse-derived customary materials record categories and valuations that treat persons as property in certain circumstances. The Old Norse word kono, a vernacular term for woman, sometimes specifically a wife, appears in lists where fines and compensations are assessed. The same legal cultures set prices for lost or stolen property, including people. In some codes, the value of a captive woman was calculated in wergild-like terms. In others, the law recognized the forcible taking of women as a war right, a consequence of victory by force. Anglo-Saxon law codes, by contrast, often frame the taking of captives as a crime, with compensations due. But the reality on the ground was hybrid. Overlapping jurisdictions, pragmatic commerce, and the demand of regional elites meant that legal prohibitions could be circumvented or reinterpreted. These juridical contours become concrete in the accounts of markets and trade routes. River systems, whether the Irish Sea, the Humber, or the routes east toward Novgorod and Kiev, acted as arteries for captive movement. Ships served as holding spaces, the hold's low, airless environment, the creak of timbers and the sharp tang of salt and pitch, the stench of dung and wet wool mingled with human breath. These sensory realities are recovered not in descriptive prose, but in layers of refuse, in the architecture of craft spaces adapted into pens, and in documentary references to cargoes that list women beside walrus ivory or slaves by number. Traders recorded sales elsewhere in more durable forms, rune stones that commemorate voyages, inscriptions that list goods bartered or losses tallied. In rare cases, these inscriptions survive as hard evidence of transactions, whose human dimension we must infer. Repton, in the English Midlands, is where several strands converge into a single stark revelation. Excavations at a site associated with a winter camp show a mass burial containing multiple individuals with perimortem trauma, arranged together in a way inconsistent with tidy ecclesiastical burial. Soil analysis and radiocarbon dating align these deposits with the years of known Viking wintering. Osteoarchaeological study reveals a disproportionate number of female remains, many showing perimortem injuries and indications of blunt force trauma, and, in some cases, signs consistent with restraint. Interpreting these findings requires caution. Trauma on bone might reflect conflict, judicial execution, or post-mortem treatment. But when combined with contemporaneous chronicles describing merciless reprisals, and with evidence of a systematic removal of certain households from the landscape, a chilling pattern emerges. At Repton, the synthesis of strata, trauma patterns, and documentary echoes suggests not just ad hoc cruelty, but organized, unit-level decisions that led to mass killing or the removal of women and families from their communities. The interpretation of Repton has been contested in the literature. Some scholars argue for battle-related mortality among combatants and civilians alike. Others read the assemblage as evidence for ritualized killing or the execution of captives. The point for this narrative is not to enforce a single sensational conclusion, but to show how multiple independent data sets, burn layers, dendrochronology, trauma analysis, and analytic reports can together change the balance of probability.
Where once a narrative might have attributed such deaths to the chaos of war, the cumulative evidence at sites like Repton shows the possibility of systematic treatment of defeated households, and especially of women associated with those households, as dispensable or marketable. Systematic is an important word. Across the British Isles and into the continent, the pattern is not merely isolated thefts by roving bands.
The archaeological signatures indicate infrastructure, holding pens in ports, repeated deposits of non-local female remains in urban cemeteries, ledger-like artifacts, not always textual but material, that act like receipts, and a legal economic matrix that allowed buyers, sellers, and owners to treat captives as capital. Contemporary commerce demanded supply. Markets in Dublin, in markets along the Irish Sea and the Baltic, and in the eastern trade nodes show correlated evidence. An abundance of foreign-origin female isotopic markers. The presence of goods associated with trade in humans, shackles, lead-lined chests for transport, and mantled strata indicating large-scale provisioning for groups held in custody. This does not collapse all women of Norse-associated contexts into a single fate. There were those who married into new communities, those who became household members with status, and those whose identities blended through generations. There were also resistors, people who escaped, who fought back, and some named individuals who appear in the record as exceptions that illuminate the rule. One such figure, recorded intermittently in later chronicles and in saga fragments, is Gunhild. The sources that mention her are fragmentary and often polemical. She may be the composite of several women who resisted enslavement or who leveraged social networks to reclaim autonomy. Where her story survives, it is as a sequence of legal pleadings, cunning negotiations, and occasional armed resistance. And it serves as a necessary counterweight to narratives that would reduce all captives to passive objects. Gunhild's life, as much as can be reconstructed, shows agency within constraint. Women could and did act, sometimes within the law, sometimes against it, and sometimes by forging alliances with those outside their captors' networks. Forensic methods have advanced the case for understanding these patterns with greater precision. Isotope analysis of dental enamel and bone collagen distinguishes childhood residents from later life movements. When cohorts of females buried in an urban cemetery have childhood isotopic signatures pointing to distant inland regions or to Scandinavian coasts, while male remains show stronger local signatures, interpretation leans toward the movement of women through capture and sale rather than balanced migratory flows. Ancient DNA adds another layer, revealing maternal haplogroups introduced or amplified in local populations in periods corresponding to intense raiding and settlement. Importantly, these genetic signals do not speak in absolutes. Genes do not prove coercion on their own. But in combination with evidence of holding enclosures, with ledger-like artifacts, and with legal contexts that allowed commodification, they form a persuasive inferential chain. The logistics of trafficking deserve attention because they turn violence into commodity.
Ships that once served for seasonal raiding were reused as transport for captives, sometimes repurposed with makeshift partitions in the hold. River routes linked markets to interior trade networks that could carry captives long distances, from the British Isles into the Irish Sea Circuit, down into Carolingian territories, or eastward toward the Rus trade networks that reached as far as Baghdad. Traders developed systems of valuation and transfer. Some manifests, where they survive or are reconstructed from secondary records, list numbers of women, ages, and sometimes distinguishing features. A reconstructed ledger entry, plausible though partial, reads like a receipt. 20 women, assorted, for market at Dublin, 8 to the eastward. Such reconstructions must be handled as provisional, but their existence in the documentary imagination aligns with material remains. Economics shaped law. Where slave labor provided agricultural, domestic, and artisanal value, elites created incentives to sustain supply. Gragos and other Norse legal texts show how fines and compensations could be used to manage disputes over property and persons. They also show that the taking of women in warfare could be normalized within legal reasoning. Conversely, in Anglo-Saxon law, a captured woman might be legally protected in principle, yet in practice, enforcement varied. The friction between law on the books and law in practice is a historical constant. In this case, it is exacerbated by the relative mobility and ruthlessness of maritime raiders, and by the emerging international market in human beings. The moral appraisal is not an anachronistic imposition of modern sensibilities, but an ethical response grounded in evidence. When historian and archaeologist combine data streams and produce a probable narrative of systematic capture, trade, and sometimes elimination of women associated with defeated households, the resulting picture must be judged. The victims, wives, daughters, and children are not merely statistics. Where osteology allows, bioarchaeologists can reconstruct age at death, signs of chronic stress, and indicators of repeated trauma or nutritional deficiency. These biological traces, read alongside the cultural record, evoke lived lives. The grinding labor of captive women, the threat of sexual violence used as a tool of domination, the rupture of kinship networks. The historical actors who benefited from this system, raiders, traders, and those who acquired captive labor, created in effect an industry that converted warfare into profit at intimate human cost. Resistance and remediation appear in fractured forms. Local communities sometimes chose annihilation of households over the humiliation of enslavement. There are accounts where families slaughtered their own members to deny captors the prize. Those acts are grim and heartbreaking evidence of the social calculus imposed by the presence of a market for human beings. Other times, external authorities or emergent rulers intervened, negotiating ransoms or reclaiming captives through diplomatic channels. Missionary agencies and ecclesiastical networks sometimes interceded, though their priorities were mixed between pastoral care and the restoration of property. Over the long term, demographic changes, the influx of maternal lineages, the absorption of captives into households, and the legal shifts under new polities changed the fabric of communities. Genetic legacy is one trace of these changes. Local oral traditions and legal codifications are others. The archive is partial, and the interpretations are provisional. Yet there are moments where multiple lines converge with troubling clarity. At Repton, the alignment of osteological trauma with analytic silence about the fate of women suggests an internalized program of violence. At Dublin and Jorvik, the material culture of markets and port infrastructures, combined with isotope and aDNA signals, argues for sustained trafficking. In law books, in runic marginalia, and in reconstructed manifests, we find the language of valuation applied to people. Together, these elements transform isolated episodes into a systemic process. If there is a single imperative that emerges from examining what happened to defeated wives in the Viking Age, it is to rehumanize. Archaeology gives voice to those who were suppressed by contemporary narratives that celebrated conquest and disregarded capture.
Bones, teeth, and inscriptions speak in their own constrained ways. The job of the historian is to assemble them without sensationalizing, to interpret without collapsing inference into certainty, and to insist that victims be remembered as persons rather than as statistics. There is also a responsibility to follow evidence further. Future isotopic baselines, larger comparative aDNA datasets, and finer-grained excavation of port contexts will sharpen inferences about scale and mechanisms. Scholarship must remain attentive to the ethical dimensions of research. How to present findings about sexual violence and slavery with accuracy and respect. How to involve descendant communities where appropriate, and how to ensure that rescue and remembrance, not exploitation, drive public reception. A final note on sources and restraint. Many of the most revealing data points come from teams who combined excavation with laboratory work. Osteoarchaeologists who conducted trauma analyses, geochemists who measured strontium and oxygen ratios, and historians who read annals with a critical eye for omission as well as commission. Their reports are the backbone of assertions made in this narrative. What follows next will examine one of the most contested sites in detail, unspooling the trench-by-trench evidence that has forced a re-evaluation of long-held assumptions about conquest and gendered violence among Norse actors. The trench matrix at Repton resists simple narratives. The differential deposition suggests social categories at death. Women and children interred with domestic objects, men with signs of martial identity. Yet the presence of foreign hacksilver and scales in adjacent pit fills complicates a tidy division between trader and captive. They evoke economic exchange in which human bodies could be entangled with portable wealth. Historical sources remain frustratingly terse. Chroniclers observe a wintering of Norse forces and a violent conflict, then move quickly to ecclesiastical matters, leaving the fates of ordinary households underreported. Where the archaeology reveals scalpings of muscle, dismemberment, and hurried burials, the annals offer silence or euphemism. That dissonance has fueled rival interpretations. Was Repton a fortified battlefield where living were slaughtered and buried in haste? A Viking winter camp cemetery with complex funerary practices? A site of punishative execution? Or a locust where captive women were detained and traded? Each hypothesis fits some strata of data and falters against others. Interpretive prudence therefore demands a synthetic account. The trench evidence at Repton records episodes of violence embedded in a broader social economy that commodified bodies. The heterogeneity of trauma types and demographics argues against a single uniform event. Instead, we should see a sequence: skirmishes and executions, rapid communal interments, subsequent scavenging and economic activity, set within a context where captives, traders, and armed retinues coexisted uneasily. Crucially, the later sanctification of the place did not erase the traces. It preserved them under later fills, making Repton both a palimpsest of grief and a locus for contested memory. Future work at Repton must sharpen chronological resolution. Improved AMS dating of discrete bone samples, targeted sampling for aDNA in contexts with clear stratigraphic integrity, and microstratigraphic analysis to distinguish simultaneous burial from palimpsestic accretion. Equally important is engagement with the ethical dimensions of display and interpretation. The women and children recovered here are not mere data points. Presenting their stories demands sensitivity to the violence endured, and to the living descendants, where identifiable, who may bear connection to these remains. As the trench profiles are reconsidered in light of these methodological advances, interpretive frameworks will need to accommodate contingency. Violence at Repton was neither exceptional nor monolithic. It was an outcome of intersecting economies, strategies of warfare, and social practices that assigned value and disposability along lines of gender, kinship, and status. The trenches thus call historians to a harder honesty, to narrate conquest without romanticizing, to name suffering without reducing it to statistic, and to trace the threads by which intimate violence became systemic.
The pattern at Repton: women and adolescents with non-local isotopic signatures, men accompanied by martial accoutrements, children in hurried pits, invites a sustained inquiry into mobility, marriage networks, and the gendered logics of economic exchange. Ethno-historic analogues and careful use of osteobiographical methods can help reconstruct life histories without overclaiming certainty. Where soft tissue injuries cannot be observed, attention to perimortem contexts, cut marks on vertebrae, clustered deposition patterns, can nonetheless speak to the choreography of violence and disposal. Fifth, the governance of archaeological practice around sites like Repton must become more multivocal. Local parishes, regional museums, descendant communities with plausible genealogical or cultural links, and academic teams should be co-authors in the production of public narratives. Co-curation is not mere virtue signaling. It yields better scholarship. Communities offer perspectives on place memory, on rituals of remediation, and on the ethical limits of display that specialists may miss. In return, scholars must offer transparent interpretation, education, and opportunities for dialogue, rather than paternalistic decisions about what can be known or shown. Beyond method and ethics, the Repton record prompts historiographical humility. The temptation to craft clear episodes of invasion, to assign heroes and villains, obscures the messy realities of frontier life, in which traders, mercenaries, kin, and captives could shift roles across seasons and generations. A synthetic account that admits layered causality, economic pressure, opportunistic raiding, elite politics, and local resentments will feel less satisfying narratively, but more honest epistemologically. It will also better serve pedagogical aims. Students and the public learn more from being led through competing hypotheses, through the reasons a certainty is unattainable, than from being presented with a tidy story that flattens complexity. Finally, there is a moral-political dimension that cannot be deferred to method sections. Sites like Repton are nodes in modern identity-making. They are invoked in nationalist histories, appropriated in folklore, or turned into commodified heritage. Scholars must call out such uses when they distort evidence or when they instrumentalize suffering for present-day agendas. This does not mean silencing public curiosity, but it does require that engagement be accompanied by critical framing and by the explicit recognition that past violence does not grant moral license for contemporary exclusionary narratives. The trenches, with their jumble of bone and metal and altered earth, therefore remain an invitation rather than a verdict.
They invite better science, yes, but also a different kind of scholarly posture, one that blends technical rigor with ethical reflexivity, that privileges plurality over certainty, and that treats remains not merely as vehicles for argument, but as the fragile testimonies of lives lived at the margins of power. To accept that invitation is to reshape the craft of historical archaeology, to make our chronologies finer, our narratives truer to ambiguity, and our public practices more respectful to the persons whose traces we study. If future campaigns at Repton adopt that posture, they will do more than resolve chronological knots or refine isotopic maps. They will model a way of knowing that honors complexity without abdicating judgment, that names suffering without reducing the dead to instruments of explanation, and that places the responsibilities of interpretation where they belong, in the hands of communities and scholars committed to telling the past with both honesty and care. In that balance lies the truest measure of what archaeology can offer. Not only knowledge, but a manner of remembering, fit for people who once lived and died within the very trenches we now seek to understand.